Make sure. Okay, very good. Oh, my Instagram did not connect. That's, well, I'm just starting to try to do that new now, so maybe I'll just, I'm not sure why it didn't connect, but that's okay. Um, yeah, so I wanted to stream today because, this morning I woke up really early and um, got online and I watched the live stream of the UN's court called the World Court, or the ICJ, announce its decision in the case dealing with Israeli genocide in the Gaza Strip. This is a very important case in my opinion because it basically you know it it really is a historic ruling. The state of Israel has gotten away with a lot of things over the years in terms of you know um, being allowed to build settlements in areas that it annexed, and doing things like uh, occupying land for 56 years. I mean, no other nation has done that in modern history without annexing it, and if they annexed it, it would be a war crime as well. So the point is that, because of the politics of Israel, it has gotten away with a lot of things that most other countries don't get away with in the modern era. I will also note that, this body, this ICJ court that we're talking about, has a track record, unfortunately, of not necessarily doing a lot in the world stage. Um, it's basically let me just. I think I have to copy the Instagram on a case by case basis. So I'm gonna add an Instagram, and we're gonna do stream key. Let's just copy that and add that. Sorry about this. Okay, let's see if that works. Um, so yeah, the court has had a track record that's been a little bit sketchy. And I'm going to go into that a little bit here in just a minute, but um, oh, okay, not sure if that's working now. So what we're gonna do today, and this is streaming on Facebook and theoretically Instagram now. Yes, very good. I think we're live on Instagram. I've also got a YouTube channel that I'll try to remember to link in the notes later. Basically, we're going to be going over the decision itself, a little bit in the background of the conflict, um, and we're definitely going to do a little bit of international law 101. I mean, the reason I'm streaming at all is because I'm a lawyer and I get a lot of questions and people are curious and about how this works. But and then we're going to do a little bit of analysis of the decision. So that's basically what we're going to do today on the stream. And I did some very brief commentary this morning as well. If you want to go back and watch the ruling, it's on my Facebook, and you can also just Google ICJ Israel Gaza ruling, and I'm sure it would come up. So let's start by going over to the decision itself. So here is a copy of the decision issued by the International Court of Justice. Now, we're going to go through this a little bit. We're not going to go through all 86 pages. I'm going to summarize that. Actually, before I do that, though, let me back up a step. This decision came out this morning, stemming from a case that was filed in December by South Africa, accusing the state of Israel of genocide. Now, in order to understand this, I'm not going to go into the history of the conflict in Israel and Gaza, but for those who don't know, I'm pulling up a map. Israel's right here. It's a state that was created by the UN, incidentally, in hold on. Sometimes my screen capture. There we go. Okay, so the state of Israel was created by the UN by a General Assembly vote in 1948, and here it is. Now, these little dotted lines are areas that were not originally part of the state of Israel. They are three little sections that Israel conquered in a war that it fought in the 1960s, the Six-Day War. And so from 1967 until the present time, 56, 57 years, Israel has occupied these three strips of land: the Golan Heights, which is less important to us for now, but also the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. The current conflict focuses on this Gaza Strip, where Israel has there was an attack by Hamas, which is one of the groups in Gaza, the ostensible government of Gaza. Its military wing, along with some other groups, entered into several small towns in southern Israel here, called kibbutzim, and massacred something like 1,200 people. Now, that happened on October 7th. Since then, Israel has invaded Gaza, destroyed about 70% of the homes there, about 50% of all buildings, has murdered more than 33,000 people now, most of whom are civilians, most of whom are women and children, and continues to do so every single day. Now, I'm not going to try to get too much into the details about what Israel's doing. I talk about that a lot in person, on social media, etc., and I'd urge you to just look it up or look at my other posts. What we're going to focus on today is the legality of this action and why the International Court of Justice got involved and why they ruled the way they did. So let's do a little bit of International Law 101. Now, I did this presentation previously on Twitter. This is a presentation dealing with the Ukrainian conflict, so it's a little bit different, but it's going to be pretty similar. So just ignore the parts that are specifically about Ukraine, but we'll go over this very quickly. All right, so yeah, there's me, a little bit of background on me and my colleague at the time. Okay, so we've got a bunch of sources of international law, things like the laws of war, the law conventions, national sovereignty, international. Basically, this is just a list of all the different things we use in international law. In terms of the law of war, there are three. There were originally 3 laws of war that were drafted in something called the Nuremberg Principles, which led to the Geneva Conventions and ultimately were adopted by this thing called the Rome Statute. The crimes of aggression, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and the crime of genocide, which was finally codified in 1998. So we're not going to be talking about crimes against humanity or war crimes, even though those are certainly also occurring in Gaza. We're only going to be talking about the crime of genocide, which is the most serious of the crimes in question. Now, under the Convention Against Genocide, which is the short, it has a longer title, but there's a convention. It's a treaty that a lot of countries, almost every country in the world has signed, and it says genocide is the following. It's when you do any of the following acts with the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. And then I list several of the, there's basically 5 things you can do to qualify. You can kill members of the group, you can cause serious injury, including mental harm, you can deliberately inflict conditions on the group calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, you can impose measures designed to prevent births within the group, or you can forcibly transfer their children. So if you do any one of those 5 things with the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, an ethnic or racial or religious or national group, you're engaged in the crime of genocide. The Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide was passed the General Assembly of the United Nations. Basically, it was put out into the world in December 9, 1948, and it was to take effect January 1951. And it didn't just criminalize genocide. It also criminalized a bunch of other, what we call inchoate crimes, which includes things like conspiracy to commit genocide, which means you're making an agreement. It includes the incitement to commit genocide, which means you're stirring people up and encouraging them to do it. Attempt to commit genocide, which is just when you do genocide and you're not successful. And then E, which is complicity in genocide, which means that you're working with people who are actually committing genocide. And that's going to come back up when we talk about the U.S. government. There's also some UN guidance about genocide, and it basically says there is a principle in international law called universal jurisdiction that basically says that the crime of genocide is so serious and so severe that even if people haven't signed that convention, they're still bound by this one law, not any other laws, just the law against genocide. And basically, it is designed to prevent states from avoiding liability under the convention by imposing universal jurisdiction. It's a controversial concept, but that is something that the UN guidance on genocide says. The UN guidance also says that it's hard to prove intent because, in general, genocide is proved by acts, and you have to infer intent. And the ICJ, so we're going to talk about the difference between the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, and the ICC, which is the International Criminal Court. But let's see here. The differences between those two entities. But basically, the ICJ rules for the responsibilities of states. The ICC handles individuals. And so going back to this page, the national courts can also get involved. So a domestic court of a country can get involved. And then several genocides have been recognized officially by the ICJ or the UN itself. This includes the 1994 Rwandan genocide, in which about 500,000 Tutsi minority population was killed in Rwanda. And then also there was so scholars largely consider the Bosnian genocide a broader genocide, but there was a particular event during the Bosnian genocide campaign in general called Srebrenica, which there was a whole trial about it, and it was fewer people died in that than the entire scope of the war, but it was found to be a genocide, and there's a lot of precedent and case law coming out of that case. And even though the international law is too new to have had that many cases, there are many other historic genocides that scholars recognize, even ones that would have qualified as genocide. They were just never litigated after that Convention Against Genocide. There we go. After the Convention Against Genocide was ratified and went into effect in 1951. For example, what was I going to say? Well, I'll have to look them up later. We'll come back to other examples of genocide. Now, going to crimes against humanity, we're not going to really cover, but this includes things that don't rise to the level of genocide. They include things like murder, extermination, enslavement, deportation or transfer, blah, 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 torture, a lot of really horrible things. Okay, very bad crimes against humanity. War crimes are as part of a large-scale policy or, system. So crimes against humanity just happen widespread and directed at the civilian population. War crimes are part of a large-scale thing, and it includes willful killing, torture, extensive destruction of property, not justified by military necessity, compelling a prisoner of war to serve in the forces of hostile power, blah, 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 all these things, taking hostages. So we've seen a lot of these things on both sides. We've seen Hamas take hostages, for example. We've seen Israel take hostages. We've seen Israel do extensive destruction and appropriation of property not justified by military necessity, like when they were blowing up universities the other day, or when the 24 Israeli soldiers were killed planting bombs in an apartment block, which was not a military target. So, these are all war crimes. But then, and this is Geneva Convention stuff, so this is part of the broader and more robust Geneva Conventions, which were codified in 1949, especially the fourth one. There were a series of them. And I don't know why some of these are red and some of them are... I think that's maybe to do with Ukraine. But anyway, crimes of aggression involve starting a war wrongfully, basically, or engaging in belligerent activity wrongfully. And then we're going to skip that. Okay, let's go to the ICJ. So here's the seal of the International Court of Justice. This is a very brief overview of this court. This is called the World Court sometimes. And it was founded, I believe, during the period between World War I and World War II. I don't know exactly. Its purpose was to adjudicate disputes between states. Its jurisdiction is premised primarily on the consent of the nations involved, and if they assent to a treaty or something like that. It issues advisory opinions. It also rules on disputes between states, and it has binding powers, but enforcement is a matter for states to do themselves. So the states that adhere to certain treaties might be compelled to help the ICJ enforce a ruling. There are precedents from this court that I could cite all day long. A couple come to mind: the Kosovo ruling, which basically ruled that Kosovo, which was a little break-off section of Serbia, had the right to do that. And then United States Nicaragua versus Nicaragua is famous because the United States was mining a harbor in Nicaragua, and the ICJ ruled that we can't do that. It's a violation of the laws of war or whatever, and the United States did it anyway. Okay, so that's the ICJ. It's located in The Hague. It's one of 6 principal organs of the UN. It was established from a predecessor court, PCIJ, in 1946. It decides cases involving boundaries, use of force, genocide, nukes, environmental issues, immunity of government officials. It has 15 judges from around the world, and they have staggered 8-year terms. And in this case, we have 2 what we call ad hoc judges, and those judges were from the 2 countries that were disputing this issue. So in this case, we had 17 judges. But basically, the purpose is to settle dispute between states and to give legal advice to the UN. Its decisions are binding, but state consent is required for it to have jurisdiction. And like I said earlier, you need sovereign nations to cooperate in enforcement mechanisms. So again, the jurisdiction is premised on consent of the state parties. All states are sovereign, so in practice, states regularly and frequently avail themselves of the ICJ because it's a better way to work things out between countries than full-blown war or violence. And the enforcement power is also premised on consent. And so there's several ways that a country can consent to the ICJ. There's compromis, which is a French term. There's a lot of French terms in this, which is a special agreement. It's called one-time consent, and it usually is after the fact. So basically, it's like when 2 countries get together and they say, let's resolve this using the ICJ. Okay. Then there's treaty clauses called compromissory clauses that basically say if you sign this treaty, you automatically pre-consent to all disputes arising under this treaty. So this would include the Convention Against Genocide. And then there's something called optional clause declaration, which means state declarations of compulsory jurisdiction without special agreement. So that's when like the UN Security Council imposes jurisdiction on a state even if it doesn't want to. That's a non-consent type of jurisdiction, but it's pretty rare. The ICJ also issues advisory opinions. One such opinion was the wall case, Israel-Palestine security wall. No, you should not build a wall in that place. So contentious cases, though, which is the one we're going to talk about today, are the most common. They can be only requested by a state, not an individual or subnational group. So if people wonder why, for example, the Palestinians didn't bring this case themselves, it's because they're not a state per se, although they have this kind of hybrid status in the UN. But either way, certainly the people of Gaza could not have brought this case. I'm not sure if the PLO could have. I suppose they could have, maybe. But South Africa definitely can. And they can bring, they're usually boring, but sometimes they get pretty heated. First, the court will consider jurisdiction, and then they will use international substantive law to resolve the dispute, such as the Convention Against Genocide. Because the states have already consented to jurisdiction, they're highly likely to consent to enforcement. That's the theory. However, we're going to talk about why that may not be the case here. Court issues binding rulings as well as temporary rulings, which is what we're going to be talking about here, called indications of provisional measures. And the international community helps to enforce those. So here's a few examples. I'm not going to read through these. Some challenges. It's premised on consent, so if a state doesn't consent to jurisdiction, then they can get out of some of these rulings sometimes. States refuse to submit to enforcement. This is a big one. That's what we did in the Nicaragua case. That's what Israel's going to probably do in this case. It has a surprisingly good track record of enforcement, though, and many states submit to jurisdiction around the time of the court's creation. And the Security Council can always veto an act of the ICJ. So, but in order to do that, they would have to pass something. In order to pass something, it has to be unanimous, and there would surely be a state that would veto the veto, if that makes sense. All right, so here's the Nicaragua case. We mined the harbor. We kind of weaseled out of submitting to the enforcement of that case. So I'm applying it to Ukraine here. It's a dispute between Russia and Ukraine, okay? The next thing, real quick, and I'm not going to go into this one because it's not really relevant for today, but the other world court that we sometimes talk about is the ICC. This is the criminal court, and it came out of the Rome Statute in 1998, began operation 2002 in The Hague. It's had 46 indictments, 26 completed prosecution. A bunch of people are on the lam, and 8 are in progress of being prosecuted. It comes out of the history of various tribunals, including Nuremberg, Tokyo, Yugoslavia, and Rwanda, which all predated the ICC, and it encourages local countries to prosecute people when possible, but it does have the ability to prosecute when the local country is unwilling or unable to. Jurisdiction, again, is based on state consent, so the state has to consent both to the Rome Statute itself or be doing something to a territory that consented to the Rome Statute, and it has to be a substantive violation of the law as well. Rome Statute prosecutes those 4 types of crimes: genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and aggression. And yeah, so here's a map of all the people subject to the Rome Statute. So as you can see here, it's hard to see, but Israel's not, but Palestine is. So the fact that Israel is doing this on Palestinian soil means that those acts can and indeed will be prosecuted at the ICC if it's ever inclined to do so. The United States is not a signatory, neither is Russia. We were, and then we withdrew our signature. The ICC lacks effective reach sometimes because actors are sheltered by uncooperative or hostile parties. Crimes must fall into one of 4 categories. And then, let's see. I'm not going to go into the procedure of how they do trials. There are criticisms. This is a Eurocentric system with heavy emphasis on African prosecutions. So this is one of the few times when we might actually see some white folks get prosecuted at the ICC. I'm going to go through, here's the page I like to point out. Here's some of the former defendants and what they were accused of. So Thomas DeLeo got 14 years for using child conscripts in war. Jermaine Katanga got 12 years for murder, pillage, sexual violence. Now, he might have been sort of complicit in that. He may not have done it, but he probably did it. It's hard to say. Matthew Chu was acquitted for crimes against humanity. Jean-Pierre Bemba got 18 years for war crimes involving sexual violence. Bhaskar Ntaganda got 30 years for crimes against humanity. Laurent Gbagbo was acquitted for crimes against humanity, but he can't return home. Abdallah Banda from Sudan is currently at large despite warrants that exist. And Dominic Ongwen from Uganda got 25 years for attempted murder, rape, sexual enslavement, and torture. So as you can see, these are all African defendants. Now, there have been 26 total prosecutions to completion, I believe we said. Let's look that up. Yeah, 26 completed. There's 12 people on the lam and 8 that are pending. And there's 9 now with Vladimir Putin. But anyway, 39 states have, well, anyway, I'm not going to go into these details, but basically, yeah, it's another way of prosecuting people for crimes. So that is my little old presentation about the laws of war. Now, applying that to the case of Israel here, let me just briefly go over what we learned this morning. So the conflict in Gaza started, as I mentioned earlier, after October 7th, although certainly the conflict between Israel and Palestine pre-existed that for a long time, and in fact Israel had been illegally occupying Gaza for about 56 years by the time of the October 7th attack. But after October 7th, Israel ramped up its military attacks on Gaza. And after it became clear that Israel was targeting civilians and doing things that were against the laws of war, South Africa filed this application to accuse Israel of genocide. This morning, after being submitted a lot of evidence and having arguments a couple weeks ago, this morning the ICJ issued a this ruling here, 86 pages, plus a couple dissents. Basically, it goes through the background of the case, and then it goes into, I'm just going to summarize each section of the ruling. It talks about October 7th. It talks about how, there's been a retaliation and how that has led to some allegations of genocide. Then it goes into jurisdiction. So for jurisdiction, it cites to the Convention Against Genocide. Let me just pull that up so you know what I'm talking about here. The Genocide Convention here is, actually, let me pull up the actual thing. It's right here. This is a very short document. Article 9 of the Genocide Convention says, disputes between contracting parties relating to the interpretation, applicability, or fulfillment of the present convention, including those related to the responsibility of a state for genocide or for any other acts enumerated in Article 3, shall be submitted to the International Court of Justice at the request of any of the parties to the dispute. So, in order to have jurisdiction, they have to be a contracting party to the Convention Against Genocide, which Israel and South Africa both are. And then there has to be, quote, a dispute. It says, at the request of any of the parties to the dispute. Disputes between the contracting parties related. So the jurisdiction requires there to be a dispute between contracting parties about the applicability of the convention, basically. So, going back to the ruling, the court just went through an analysis about all the communication back and forth, and it found that there was, South Africa said, hey, you guys, you're committing genocide, and Israel's like, no, we're not. That's bullshit. We're not doing genocide. And then South Africa says, yes, you are, and Israel's like, nah. And then South Africa's like, how about we have a meeting to talk about it? Israel's like, hell no. And then South Africa's like, okay, we're going to file something in the International Court of Justice then. And then Israel's like, actually, now that you filed that, can we have that meeting? And then South Africa's like, no, fuck you. So that's basically the history of their discussion. The court found conclusively, without controversy, that there clearly was a dispute about the applicability of the convention. Therefore, there was jurisdiction because both were contracting parties to the convention. The next question was standing, which is, does South Africa have standing to bring this case? Now, normally, you would have to have something called... I gotta go back to this. Sorry, I forgot to... I've been talking like you're reading this along with me, but you're not. I wish I... actually, let me just... screen main cam second. Video. Okay, there we go. So, sorry, I had to reset my webcam settings on this. But basically, this is the ruling here, and this is, the section on jurisdiction. Like I said, there's a dispute between contracting parties. Going on to section 2 here, is standing. Now, going back to the convention, it says any contracting, this is Article 8 now, any contracting party may call upon the competent organs of the United Nations to take such action under the Charter of the United Nations as they consider appropriate for the prevention and suppression of acts of genocide enumerated in Article 3, which is up here. Genocide, conspiracy, incitement, attempt, and complicity. So, the court probably, I'm sure they cite Article 8. Article 9 they cite here. Well, anyway, the point is that it's very clear from the convention itself that any state that is a contracting party that is aware of facts constituting genocide has standing to bring those. And even if there was a problem about why don't the Palestinians bring it, well, like I said earlier, it's difficult for a non-state in a time of being massacred to bring an action. So it makes sense that another country would bring it. So then it goes on to cite other provisions of the Convention Against Genocide, and ultimately concludes that South Africa does indeed have standing. Okay, let me just... did I skip a section? I might have skipped a section. Okay, so after... Yeah, here we go. Then it goes on to discuss the provisional measures thing. Now, provisional measures in international law is basically like a temporary restraining order in domestic law. In other words, it's a preliminary ruling, it's not a final ruling, about whether something is happening such that the court needs to intervene. And in this case, the court said, yes, we need to intervene because if we don't intervene, this is going to keep going and it probably will be a genocide. And we're not ruling finally on that it is a genocide. We're just ruling for now that they've made a good showing that it's potentially genocide, and we need to get involved to protect the rights of the people being subjected to it. Then we go down to Section 5, which is risk of irreparable prejudice and urgency. And this one basically says that if they don't act now, it's going to be bad. And they go into all the details about how people are literally starving, how 33,000 people. Let me pull this up just so you know. If you go to the Euromed Human Rights Monitor's Twitter, they have this excellent Twitter, and it tracks. This is the best source of information. It's a non-government organization, so it's a not affiliated with Israel or Palestine, and this one does take into account people presumed dead under the rubble, unlike the Gaza Ministry of Health, which is a ironically more conservative estimate. Here, as you can see, 33,360 people have died as of today, or as of yesterday, January 25th. 64,000 injured, 2 million displaced, 75,000 homes destroyed, almost 200,000 homes damaged, 117 journalists killed, the most of any conflict in history, 172 UN workers killed or injured, 376 mosques damaged, 3 churches damaged, 675 medical personnel killed or injured, 223 hospitals, ambulances, and clinics bombed or destroyed. So the point is that these numbers are very similar to the Bosnian genocide, and it is important to keep that in mind as we go through this. But yeah, the court basically kind of analyzed that. They analyzed the statements of Israel's leaders that called Palestinians children of darkness, and Benjamin Netanyahu called for the extermination of every man, woman, and child in Gaza. President Isaac Herzog said that there are no civilians in Gaza; they're all guilty. I think it was one of the cabinet ministers, Shmotrik, I think, said that the Palestinians are human animals and they should be treated as such. I mean, there's a litany, like dozens and dozens of statements by Israeli officials calling for the complete massacre of Gazan civilians. It's one of the most troubling things about this entire case, and that's why it's so important. But anyway, it goes through that, and it basically says they need to get involved, they need to issue an order now, otherwise there's going to be a problem. And then they have a conclusion where they issue their orders. So let's go through the orders that they issued real briefly. The court voted by 15-2 to order Israel to stop engaging in acts that fall within the scope of the Genocide Convention, which implies, by the way, and real quick, before I do that, let me read you the most important paragraph of this whole thing. The most important paragraph of this whole thing is paragraph 54, which is the paragraph where they rule that genocide is basically occurring. It says, in the court's view, the facts and circumstances mentioned above are sufficient to conclude that at least some of the rights claimed by South Africa and for which it is seeking protection are plausible. This is the case with respect to the right of Palestinians in Gaza to be protected from acts of genocide and related prohibited acts identified in Article 3, and the right of South Africa to seek Israel's compliance with the latter's obligations under the convention. Now, that is legal speak for South Africa has presented a plausible case of genocide, and that is sufficient for purposes of this legal case to conclude that it needs to issue an order to tell it to stop. So paragraph 54, if anybody tells you there wasn't a finding of genocide, there was. It's not final. This is a provisional order, but it's a temporary ruling that, hey, looks like you've got some genocide there. Better stop, otherwise you're definitely going to end up with a genocide finding, and you need to stop right now. That's basically what it's doing. It's kind of like probable cause in criminal law, how you can have probable cause to arrest somebody, but you have to prove them guilty at trial, and sometimes they're innocent, but there's still probable cause. Probable cause is just reasonable evidence that would convince somebody that maybe, a crime probably occurred. In this case, it's called plausibility, but it's basically the same thing in this context. All right, so by 15-2, the court voted to order Israel to stop committing genocide, including by stop killing members of the group. That means stop killing civilians, causing injury and mental harm to civilians, deliberately inflicting on the civilian population of Gaza conditions of life calculated to bring its physical destruction in whole or in part, and imposing measures intended to prevent births within that group. Now, this is interesting because they listed 4 of the 5 ways to commit genocide. If they wanted to just repeat the code section about genocide, they could have done all 5, but they didn't do the forcible transfer of children provision, and they specifically itemized all 4 of those, which implies strongly that those 4 have been documented, and the court was inclined to believe that they're doing that, such that they need to be ordered to stop doing that. Israel shall take all measures within its power to prevent the commission of all acts within the scope of the Genocide Convention, including these 4 things: killing, injuring, making life unlivable, and preventing birth. So that is a rather damning indictment. So that's 15-2 on that one. We'll come back to the 2 dissenters in a minute. 2, Israel shall ensure that its military doesn't do any of the above things. 15-2. 3, 16-1, including the Israeli judge, State of Israel shall take measures to punish people inciting genocide. 4, by 16-1, Israel needs to do much more to immediately address the urgent needs of the basic services and humanitarian assistance in Gaza. And then 5, by 15-2, was Israel needs to preserve evidence in relation to the acts committed in Gaza to determine finally and fully whether they committed genocide. So in other words, if a bunch of evidence gets destroyed by Israel, that's going to look really bad now, because there's an order by this court that says, hey, we think you might be committing genocide, so don't be destroying a bunch of that evidence now. And if they do, it looks horrible. And then finally, number 6 is by 15-2, Israel must do a report back to talk about if they're complying within a month. All right, so that is the order. And then let me just briefly share with you that there were a couple of dissents. There's this one by Judge Sebutinde from Uganda that just dissented completely and just said, we don't, I think this is more of a thing for diplomats to work out. And then there's this one by Judge Barak, who's the Israeli judge. And I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I do want to read this third to last paragraph because I think it's interesting. He says, genocide is a shadow over the history of the Jewish people, and it is intertwined with my own personal experience. The idea that Israel is now accused of committing genocide is very hard for me personally, as a genocide survivor deeply aware of Israel's commitment to the rule of law as a Jewish and democratic state. Throughout my life, I have worked tirelessly to ensure that the object and purpose of the Genocide Convention is realized in practice, and I have fought to make sure that genocide disappears from our lives. So in other words, the Israeli judge, is very disturbed about the idea that Israel may have committed genocide. Now, he is disagreeing that they did that, but he says the idea that Israel is now accused of committing genocide is very hard for me personally. And I think that's kind of the point of this case. I think this is really a wake-up call for some people in Israel and some Zionists to grapple with the idea that the Israeli state is not this perfect little gem that never does anything wrong. Frankly, it's been a pariah state in many ways for many years because it's been doing a lot of illegal things, not the least of which has been the illegal land occupation that's been going on for the last 56 years. But I just thought that was an interesting dissent. Actually, pulling up my list, I've got a list. Judges. No, ICJ. Well, here we go. I'm just going to do the Wikipedia on this. I have my own list, but here's a list of the ICJ judges that ruled on this. The one member that dissented was this one. Okay, so that means United States, Brazil, Morocco, France, Slovakia, China, Somalia, India, Jamaica, Australia, Russia, Lebanon, Japan, Germany, and Belgium all voted for the finding of genocide. In addition to that, they sat 2 interim judges, one from Israel and one from South Africa. The South African went along with every charge. The Israeli judge only went along with the humanitarian aid and the stop inciting genocide charge. So that is the breakdown. When I first did my predictions, I thought this was going to go like 9-6 or 10-5. To get all 14 out of the 15, on board is an incredibly unexpected and wonderful outcome. It is a definitive and unassailable finding of genocide by this court. And so here's how it's going to matter now. And I do need to finish. My cat's yelling at me. He's saying, Joseph, finish the stream. I need to wrap up here, but let me just wrap up by briefly talking about what this means. So first of all, um, the Genocide Convention itself has no inherent enforcement ability. It can be enforced in one of several ways. It can be enforced by the ICC through individual prosecutions and referrals there. It can be enforced by states taking action unilaterally against the state committing genocide, in this case Israel. It can be enforced multilaterally through treaties or sanctions or a UN vote even. So here's what's going to happen. Israel's going to have to decide whether it's going to deny this altogether or whether it's going to say, "Oh yeah, okay, fine, we'll comply," and then it's going to do its normal kind of bullshit stuff where it kind of glosses over what's happening and kind of pretends like it's going along. I'm not sure which one of those two things they're going to do. My guess is a little bit of both. They're probably going to say, "Yeah, we're complying, but it's still bullshit, but we're still complying," and then it's going to be up to the rest of the world to enforce this, to stop this genocide. It's a sad state of affairs when the Houthi group in Yemen is doing more to follow the obligations of the Genocide Convention than most Western states. I'm not defending Houthis' attacks on ships, but I'm just saying they have a better sense of urgency than many Western states. What needs to happen, and what probably will happen to some extent, is the world is going to start isolating Israel the longer this goes on. There's going to be a ton of pressure on the West to not allow this to continue. And everybody that talks about this issue now is going to cite this case. It's going to say, yeah, the ICJ, you may not believe me, but the ICJ, representing 15 judges from around the world, from all parts of the world, different religions, different races, different legal cultures, they all came together and almost unanimously concluded that Israel was committing genocide, at least provisionally made that decision. So, don't take my word for it, take their word for it. It's going to have a powerful moral impact, and then it's going to lead to some sort of pressure on the UN itself to perhaps take votes, either in the Security Council or in the General Assembly, that could lead to sanctions. It could lead to condemnation. It could lead to states blockading or embargoing trade with Israel. It could lead to all sorts of negative sanctions that we saw kind of happen at Russia. It could mostly, we're talking economic punishment. And certainly if the ICC would get its act together, we could also see prosecutions down the road because an ICJ finding is binding in the ICC. Then also it could lead to other actors starting to treat this more seriously, like the United States, although I'm skeptical because in addition to genocide itself, complicity in genocide is also unlawful. And so if we're complicit in genocide, we may be subject to penalties. So it's going to require diplomatic effort to enforce. It's not just going to enforce itself, but it's a huge deal. It's a historic deal. It's a great ruling. Some people are upset that they didn't use the word ceasefire. There was never any possibility that the ICJ was going to order a ceasefire, and even if it did, Israel was just going to ignore it. So long story short, this is a great, profound ruling. It's the right ruling. It's 15-2, which is an amazing overwhelming majority, almost unanimous ruling that says, Israel, you're committing genocide, cut it out, basically. It's morally powerful reading through it, and the announcement this morning made me so happy. So that is the breakdown of what's going on with the ICJ ruling. It's probably one of the most important cases of any of our lifetime. Why? Because genocide is the most serious crime we have on this planet. And so when a country that we're ostensibly allies with engages in genocide, and when we as taxpayers are funding that genocide, it's a big deal, and we need to stand up against it. So I applaud anybody that's taking to the streets, that's engaging in nonviolent civil disobedience, that's engaging in any sort of agitation or activism around this issue. We need to keep pushing our public officials to stand up against this, and we really need to stop the mass slaughter of children in Gaza. Thank you so much for watching. If you have any questions, just drop me a message on one of my social media, and we'll get back to you.